It's time to get into the holiday spirit. Let's talk about what the ideal Christmas wish list should look like for Washington fans in the 2027 class.
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. I'm the site editor with Huskies Wire. Thanks for making this your first watch or first listen of the day, as we are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, the #1 sports podcast network. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. If you want to be right in the middle of the action this season, visit FanDuel.com and place your NFL live bets all season long. And just a quick reminder to all you everydayers out there, wherever you're getting this podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, wherever that might be, please make sure to click that subscribe button, click that little bell as well, so you never miss when we post a new show. Plus, if you're on the audio only side of things, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review, as it does help the show out a lot. Now, I got a really fun show coming at all you everydayers out there. I want to talk about the 2027 class. And I thought one of the best ways to do it was to put together a little bit of a Christmas wish list, since it is Christmas Eve, as all you everydayers out there are listening to it. So I want to talk about a whole bunch of top targets that I think are absolute must-gets for the Huskies in the 2027 class. I tried for the most part to limit it to one player per position, but with some immense needs in the trenches, you'll see how I wound up coming up with this. But as always, we start on the offensive side of the ball. And one of the guys who is absolutely an immense need for the Huskies in the 2027 class is Sione Kaho, the 4-star quarterback at a Lincoln High School in Tacoma. He's ranked as the #2 player in the state of Washington by 247 Sports. And this is a guy who, it's very obvious, right? Washington needs to go out and secure a high-end quarterback in each and every single class to keep the competition in that room high and start preparing for life after Demond Williams, whatever that is going to wind up looking like. And a guy like Sione Kaho is certainly a perfect example of what you need in this class. And somebody, in my opinion, the reason I was going to start with the defensive side, to be totally frank with you, but the reason I wanted to start with the offensive side is because of Sione Kaho. Because if this is a guy who, let's say you can secure his commitment within the next, 6 to 8 weeks, let's call it something like that, as it seems like he's really down to Oregon and Washington. If you can make that big push, keep him home, keep him in state, all of a sudden, when you get that piece, it's something that you can really use on the recruiting trail. It's, hey, look at that. We do have one of the best quarterbacks on the West Coast and in the country. He's ranked in the top 20, I believe, depending on which service you go and look at. He's one of those guys who players will start to gravitate towards him. You already got a high-end 4-star wide receiver in Braylon Pope. Now you need to keep adding to that. And I think Sione Kaho, in terms of what he brings with not just his arm talent, but athletically, is such a good fit for the offensive scheme that Jedd Fisch wants to run. And he's one of those guys who, if he does wind up being the successor to Demond Williams, he does wind up at Washington and beats out, let's just say it's Dash Byerly, Tristan Keeney-McMillan, and Derek Zammit, and they don't take any other transfer portal quarterbacks. That's just the battle whenever Demond Williams decides to move on. I think that that is something that everyone is going to be happy with, not just in the sense of, hey, you brought in a lot of guys with a whole ton of upside, and the player who you believe to be the best won in that department, but it's a local guy who fans around here are really going to be able to hang their hats on, which is, I think, is something that is always a really important part of just the UW program. And a kid like that from Tacoma would certainly be a massive win in that regard. Speaking of massive wins, one of my absolute favorite prospects to watch in this class is 4-star running back Noah Roberts. And I think that especially after the announcement that running back Adam Hamid entered the transfer portal, Noah Roberts went from probably being a guy who I honestly might not have talked about in terms of right off the top here as one of the most important players. Running back absolutely just vaulted to the top of the list. I'm still certainly of the mind that Washington is going to go out and look for a transfer portal running back with a year of eligibility to really come in and help just ease the load on guys like Brian Bonner and Jordan Washington in the 2026 season, and really help in pass protection as well. But moving forward in 2027, I don't think that's going to be the case, because if you can go out and secure a guy like Noah Roberts, who is just drawing all kinds of elite comparisons, when you go look at what he's been able to put together down in Arizona, he's drawing comparisons to Bijan Robinson from the 2018, 2019 class, whatever it was, during his time coming out of Arizona. South Point Catholic is where he was. If you're able to secure a guy like that, who is a true bell cow, just that's what he's projected as at 6'1", 195, 200 pounds, I believe is what he's listed at at this point in time. A dude like that with the pass catching ability, the run after catch, what he's able to do between the tackles, the vision, the cutback ability, the long speed, all of the athleticism and running back skills that he shows on tape is a lot like Brian Bonner in terms of this is a guy who you can get on the field early. You can continue bulking him up and turn him into the elite running back prospect that you want him to be. When you go look at the rankings, he's taken an interesting dive in terms of dropping down some rankings over the course of his junior year. But when you just go and you watch the film, this is a guy who absolutely deserves to be mentioned among the 5 or 10 best running backs in the country in the 2027 class. And it certainly doesn't hurt that he goes to Basha High School, the alma mater of Damon Williams. And he's just one of these guys where the more I watch his film, the more I say, I certainly trust Scotty Graham, Washington's running backs coach, to go out there and get the job done in that regard, because this is just one of those guys who, again, he just fits this room perfectly. And with or without Adam Muhammad around, I think that this was going to be a class where the Huskies only wound up taking one running back. And I certainly believe that he is going to be the guy that is number one on Washington's board in terms of what he brings to the table. And another guy who I think is number one on Washington's board in a very different way is 3-star offensive lineman Reis Russell from Colorado. This is a kid who I've been extremely interested in for a very long time because he was one of the guys who very early on was connected to Washington during his sophomore season. He came out for a couple of unofficial visits over the course of the year. And if he winds up being one of the just earlier commitments in Washington's class based on where they stand with him, some of the comments that he's made to various other recruiting reporters, I think that this would be one of those guys who is just such a big time addition. And I'm sure there are people saying, well, hold on there. There are a whole bunch of other really, really good offensive linemen that the Huskies are interested in, whether it be some of those guys from Arizona, DeJon Yarborough, the teammate of Noah Roberts being one of those prime examples, Jacoba Doyle, who we'll talk about a little bit later on, spoiler alert, from here in Washington, the 4-star offensive lineman, the number one offensive lineman in the state. Yeah, absolutely. But the reason I wanted to talk about Reis Russell first is because Washington is looking for a true center kind of player, and that's exactly what he is. He's done a really good job in the middle of the offensive line in high school, and finding someone with true center experience with that kind of body who would be able to step in early on in his college career if needed is just so important, because I look at some of these other offensive linemen that Washington is in on, and yeah, it'd certainly be great if a guy like 4-star Lincoln Maggio was able to commit to Washington and then move inside and play center at the next level. But when you have one of those guys who is just like a pure center, a lot in the vein of Landon Hatchett, where when he was coming out of Ferndale High School, it was very clear that, because obviously he played that at the high school level, that he was going to always wind up as a center at the next level. And that's exactly how I feel about Reis Russell as well. And through some channels, it sounds like Washington is getting really, really excited about rising redshirt freshman Lowen Coleman-Brusa in the middle of the offensive line, which doesn't come as a shock to me. I really am intrigued by what he brings on tape and just how his feet move and everything like that. And I think Reis Russell is a very similar prospect in that regard. And it's just all about stacking depth in the middle of the offensive line. And especially after we saw Zach Henning announce his intentions to enter the transfer portal, just like with how Noah Roberts vaulted up my rankings in that regard, I would say the exact same thing about what Reis Russell brings to the table, because he's just one of those guys who, when you look at him, when you see him in person, it's okay. Yeah, that looks like a dude who could be a 3-4 year starter in the middle of the offensive line with just the way he's built, his body type, all that sorts of stuff. But then you throw on the film and just how strong he is in his lower half and how he understands pass protection in the middle at this point of his career are all things that I think are very, very important to this coaching staff. But with that being said, let's jump over to the defensive side of the ball. Right after a message from our good friends over at FanDuel, NFL Sundays move fast, one big play, and suddenly everything feels different. That's what makes live betting with FanDuel so exciting. You're not just watching the game, you're reacting to it in real time. With FanDuel, you can place bets as the action unfolds, every drive, every momentum swing, every highlight moment. Live betting is best when the game starts to shift, a receiver gets hot, a defense tightens up, or the momentum flips after a turnover. FanDuel lets you jump into the moment. Live spreads and money lines adjust instantly. Player props update as guys heat up. You can bet next touchdown scores, drive results, totals, and more. It keeps you locked into every snap, every drive, every possibility. So if you want to be right in the middle of the action this season, visit FanDuel.com and place your NFL live bets all season long. FanDuel, the game moves fast, and so can you. So let's talk about the defensive side of the ball. I put out a poll with all of our wonderful insiders. If you want to check that out, the link to that is down in the description below. You get a free 2-week trial. After that, it's $4.99 a month. I'm dropping all sorts of breaking news, polls, Q&As, all that kind of stuff goes on over there. It's a whole lot of fun. It all goes right to your text message inbox. So I certainly recommend checking that out. And there was one guy who was the consensus across the board through not just the insiders, but I reached out to some fellow members of the UW media space. And the consensus number one overall name across everybody, and this is not going to come as a shock to any of you everydayers out there, is 4-star defensive tackle Tevita Nonu from O'Dea High School right here in Seattle. This is a guy who, it's very obvious why Washington needs to go out and get him. And like I said, all you everydayers out there, you know this because I've talked about him every single time the 2027 class comes up. This is a really interesting defensive line class on the West Coast where there is a significant amount of talent more than the last, I want to say, 4 classes combined. If we're being real, if you want to go back and look through all the blue chip talent in some of those classes versus what we're seeing in 2027, it is absolutely mind blowing. And seeing that one of those players is right here in your backyard playing at Seattle's traditional staple power program is so important because if you're able to secure a guy like that, it's a really great building block for the class. Look at what Derek Coleman-Brusa was for the 2026 class. And I feel that Tevita Nonu is that plus some. And I'm not saying that to take anything away from Derek because Derek is obviously a tremendous player in his own regard, but it's more so the positional value because defensive tackle is just so rare on the West Coast. You can go out and you can find a whole bunch of hyper athletic, high end edge rusher kind of players. Usually they're not all blue chip kind of guys, but I feel like those have been more frequent to find on the West Coast in recent years than true defensive tackles like Tevita Nonu. And this is just one of those guys where you throw on the tape at 6'3", 275 pounds is what I believe he's listed at this point in time. He's one of those guys who can just be a true game wrecker for you in the middle of the field. And in what Ryan Walters wants to run in terms of if he wants to get back to his more traditional, or for him at least, 5 down fronts along the defensive line versus staying in the cover 3 more, truly traditional in terms of around college football, 4-2-5 sort of look that he ran in 2025. No matter what it is, having a guy who can rush the passer in the middle like Tevita Nonu is absolutely critical to that. And going out and finding a way to secure that guy who's right in your backyard and for whatever reason hasn't necessarily blown up nationally the way I believe he deserves to. In terms of when you go look at his offer list, he's got some other big time offers, Notre Dame, Penn State, standing out as some of the other big ones, but he's really flown under the radar a little bit. And that's something where I believe that Washington is going to just try to move in and say, hey, look, we believed in you for a really long time. We'd love to keep you home and just you can show the rest of the Big Ten what you're really all about right here in your hometown. And I certainly think that that's a pitch that with a lot of guys around here can certainly resonate. And so I'm curious to see this recruitment as it goes forward, because I think in terms of most Husky fans, if you'd ask them, hey, who's your number one overall priority target in the 2027 class, I think Tevita Nonu would certainly be the most common answer. And in terms of what he brings to the field, with what we're going to see from this 2026 class along the defensive line, if you can keep stacking and adding to that with elite high-end talent in the 2027 class, that's going to be absolutely vital. Like I said, I didn't want to double up on a whole lot of positions, but defensive line is certainly one that you need to double up on at this point in time. So let's talk about 4-star edge rusher Troy Bowens. This is a guy who Washington has certainly made a big push for a very long time. And in terms of the athlete that he is at 6'4" and 250 pounds down at Suter High School in California, this is a dude who I'm just absolutely enamored with, because you look at the rankings, he's top 175, top 200, depending on which site you prefer to look at for recruiting rankings. And I think he is wildly underrated, because it's not just the skill, the movement skills, the athleticism, all those sort of testing numbers. When you go look through his Twitter page, you'll see some of the miles per hour that he's able to get up to and how quickly he gets off the ball, some different things like that. But you look at his film and that frame at 6'4" and 250 pounds, he's one of those dudes who I think of him a lot like not just what Derek Coleman-Brusa was, but I think I think of him a lot like Laiatu Latu. When Washington was able to secure his commitment back in the 2019 class, I think Laiatu might be a slightly better athlete than he was because he was just an absolute freak of nature in that department. But I don't think Troy Bowens is as far off as you might think in terms of the burst, the first step. And as he continues to put things together in terms of his more advanced pass rush moves, this is a dude who should absolutely fly up the boards as his high school career continues, let's say. And as I look forward to what the winter and the spring and the summer is going to look like for him, I think Washington is going to be right in the middle of things. He was able to come up for an unofficial visit for the Ohio State game, and he spoke to rivals Adam Gorney and said that the Huskies were the favorite at that point in time. And that's something I'm certainly going to keep watching because you need to go out and secure at least one high-end edge rusher in the 2027 class. And I think this coaching staff absolutely understands that. And Troy Bowens is one of those guys who, if you go look at all of the true edge rushers in the West, I feel like it's between him and Crew Jones in Utah for who is the best pure prospect in that department. And I personally would probably give the edge to Troy Bowens. And again, as his recruitment continues, he is going to continue to blow up and going to continue to get offers. And it's on Jason Kafusi, Aaron Van Horn, Ryan Walters, Jedd Fisch, and this entire coaching staff to go all in and do whatever it takes to earn a commitment from a guy like that. Because when it was really needed in the 2026 class, we saw that. We saw them go out and secure T.I. Mukais, which was certainly not an easy battle to win, if as all you ever dares remember. He goes out and he secures J.D. Hill late in the cycle. Matt Doherty talked a little bit on the show about what that recruiting process was like. And David Schmerzel, it took his fourth commitment to get there, but you were able to go out and get that job done in a way that was, I don't want to say convenient for what Washington wanted to do, but in a way that worked for everybody. And I think that that's something where, in terms of Troy Bowens, you have to find a way to make it work for everybody. But if you need to, let's just say, overextend financially in terms of NIL and promises to make sure that that guy is a member of your 2027 class, that is something that should be of the utmost priority for this coaching staff. So one more guy I want to get to on the defensive side of the ball here. Let's talk about the secondary. I need to talk about four-star safety, Isala Aisa Wily-Ava. This is a dude who I am just so intrigued by with this class. Four-star safety out of St. John Bosco down in Southern California. This dude is just a tailor-made fit for not just tailor-mades, pun intended there, but for Washington's defense as a whole, because Ryan Walters, and I've talked about this a lot, Ryan Walters loves to have a defense that is predicated around a safety who can tackle. And at 6'2", 200 something pounds, Isala Aisa Wily-Ava is a safety that can tackle. And he can do so much more than that. He had 7 interceptions during his sophomore year. He showed off tremendous range and ball skills that got him named a Max Preps sophomore All-American that season. And he's just continued to grow. And Washington has done an amazing job in this recruitment. When you look at his top 8, they're fighting against the likes of Texas, Michigan, Ohio State. He holds a crystal ball to choose Washington, which is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about him right now. Because when you look at what he brings to the table, again, he is a tailor-made fit. And it's not just at that post or that box safety role, but he's one of those guys that can play that pseudo inside linebacker position that we saw Alex McLaughlin do at times over the course of the year, because how he's able to just identify plays and trigger downhill quickly as a blitzer, as a run defender. And again, with a guy who can tackle in the way that he can, with the coaching that he's received in the Trinity League at St. John Bosco, those are all things that certainly cannot be ignored. And I think that when you look at what this safety room is kind of shaping up to be, I look at the 2026 class and I think that Gavin Day would certainly be a tremendous fit in that department, but he also just has a little bit more range, in my opinion, than Isala at this point in time. I think they're both exceptional athletes for their sizes. And you just think about the back end of a defense like that, where you still have Ryland Dillard-Allen in that mix. And I assume you'd want to add one more safety in the 27 class. But if you're building a secondary around these big hitting, super physical guys, especially when you want to throw a guy like Rajon Duncan into that same ballpark as well, this defense could be one of the most physical, hardest hitting, whatever it is you want to say, in the Big Ten. And I think that's exactly what Taylor Mays, John Richardson, and Ryan Walters are all looking for in that department. And if you can start that, just again, considering where Isala is in his recruiting process at this time, if you can start that with a commitment from him, you look at some of the other guys that the Huskies are in on in this class, and I think that that would just be such a tremendous building block, just like in the way that a lot of these guys are for their respective position groups or for this class as a whole, because I've talked about this a lot in terms of this 2027 class. It's not going to be as big as 2026. We're not going to see 26 commitments. I'm sure it's probably going to be somewhere in the range of 18 to 21 at the end of the day, is just my initial estimation. But the emphasis of this class is big game hunting and going after these big time prospects. And Isala, Aisa, Wily-Ava, who is one of the top 200 players in the nation, playing on the back end at safety like that would be such a perfect way to kick that off. So with that being said, let's talk about some of these honorable mentions that I've got. Coming down this home stretch here, let's talk about a couple other guys who should absolutely be on all Washington fans' wish lists. The first one is probably my personal favorite player to watch in the 2027 class, and that's four-star defensive tackle Jon Ioane from Tustin High School down in Southern California. As you all you ever do is know out there, I've talked about this kid a lot because I certainly believe that when we look at what Washington needs to bring in the 2027 class along the interior of the defensive line, it's 2, 3, maybe even a fourth high-end projectable body. And Jon Ioane fits that bill to a T. And one of my favorite things about him is not just the fact that he plays both offensive and defensive line down at Tustin High School, which has given him a really great understanding of how to rush the passer, how to just use his weight effectively, different things like that in terms of hand fighting as well. All of those different, just more advanced things that you don't see from a whole ton of high school prospects, which is one of the reasons that I was so high on T.I.U. Mukais in the 2026 cycle. But it's also because he plays quarterback. It's just so much fun to talk about the fact that Tustin is more than comfortable throwing him out there in some different Wildcat packages and things like that, because it just speaks volumes to what his football IQ is, that they trust him to understand the offense enough to go out and run it effectively. No matter how limited might be what those plays might look like, the fact that he does that is just so much fun. And it's absolutely something that I think you should keep in mind, because I believe that Washington's coaching staff absolutely feels that way. And he's one of those guys who, like I said, is certainly at the top of the board in the regard of what Washington is looking for along the interior of the defensive line. And I feel that he is going to be one of the top targets. And when official visits start getting set up, whenever that might be, February, March, in that regard, get announced for, again, April, May, June, whenever they wind up coming up here, Jon Ioane is going to be one of the first names that you hear about Washington doing everything in their power to set up an official visit with, because he is just that kind of prospect and can absolutely, alongside Tevita Nonu, be another game-changing piece along the interior of the defensive line. Now, also, like I said earlier, tried to keep it to one per position, but there are so many of these positions where multiple bodies are just always needed in every single class, and the offensive line is one of those. So let's talk about four-star offensive lineman Jacoba Doyle from Puyallup High School right here in Washington. This is another one of those guys where you turn on the film, and I love what he brings to the table from a technical standpoint at this point in time, but like a lot of these offensive linemen, it's also just the big, physical, projectable body where he's one of those guys where I feel like he could play guard, he could play tackle at the next level, and as you want to keep stacking bodies along the offensive line, he is one of those guys that raises not just the floor of the room, but the ceiling as well with the talent that he brings to the table. And I talked about it earlier, keeping as many players in state in this class is so important. And it's why I talked about Tevita Nonu earlier on. It's why I talked about Sione Kaho earlier on as well, because with those guys, plus Braylon Pope, plus some of these other players that the Huskies have extended offers to in the 27 class, whether it be Maurice Williams, the cornerback down at Graham Kapowson, tight end Zach Albright from Glacier Peak. There are a lot of really nice players in this class in the state of Washington. And if you can build it from close to home and then expand out into Oregon, into California, Arizona, and then move it further east as well, there are so many players. There's just so much expectation, I should say, actually, for Washington to continue building on the highest ranked recruiting class in school history at number 12 in the 2026 cycle, because it's very clear that what Jedd Fisch and this coaching staff is selling on the recruiting trail, these recruits are buying. And we're starting to see more of these national recruits from Texas, from Florida, just from further east, include Washington in their top 8s, top 10s, top 12s, which isn't everything, right? You have to get them on campus. You have to get that commitment, and then you have to get that signature. It's obviously a very long process, but it's also one of those things where when you look at it from a standpoint of some of these guys, from Trey Moore out of Texas is a name who I wasn't going to talk about a whole ton today because Washington does have one receiver committed. But Trey Moore is one of those guys where if you look at how he might view Washington, it was great to get him up on an unofficial visit for the Illinois game, but his perception of Washington might be, promoted to an even higher regard when it's, they've got 4 or 5 blue chip players in the state and they're all staying home to play for the Huskies. Oh, okay. Yeah. That's certainly something I'm going to give a closer look to, because before they started recruiting me, maybe I didn't know a whole bunch about Washington. I'm not saying that for him in particular, but I'm just saying that has always been the consensus of a lot of players from outside of Washington's normal recruiting footprint before they start hearing from the Huskies and before they start getting recruited by UW. And I think that a guy like Jacoba Doyle, with some of the offers that he's starting to rack up from a lot of the premier programs out west, and as his name continues to just grow, I think he's one of those guys that could see a major rise between his junior and senior year. If you're able to get a guy like that in the boat with everything he brings to the table and what he can add to your offensive line, that would be such a huge win. So talk about the state of Florida. Let's talk about one of the guys who is originally from Washington that decided to move out there. And that's linebacker Liufau Lamoli from IMG Academy, originally played at Eastside Catholic. This is one of those guys who, when I was just going back and forth with a couple of our insiders, this was a name that came up a lot. And shout out to all the insiders who mentioned him, because I, to be honest, was not thinking about him among the very top names on my board, mainly due to just the positional value of, say, what Isala Aisa Wily-Ava brings to defense versus all of the defensive linemen that are absolutely necessary to this class. But that's not to say that Liufau Lamoli is not really important, because as insider Bob pointed out to me, when you have 3 linebackers that are going to be graduating at the end of the year, with Buda Alukta, who'd probably wind up getting another year if he really wants it, that's a situation for another day to monitor. Jacob Manu, X-Ray Alexander, all moving on. Yeah, you absolutely want to keep adding depth to that room. And it's certainly something that you need to keep a very close eye on. And I think, as like Matt Doherty talked about on the show a couple weeks ago, as Washington's scouting process of linebackers continues to change, as they start looking for bigger, longer, athletic bodies who can not just play one position, but move around the formation a little bit, I think that UW's linebacker room is in great hands moving forward with Zadrius Rainey-Solid, Ramzak Fruin, some of the guys behind him that might not see a whole bunch of run in 2026, but will moving forward in Jonathan Epperson, Donovan Robinson, and adding Liufau Lamoli to that as well gives you not just a really talented, athletic, high-end linebacker room, but it gives you a very passionate local one as well. Like I said, with him being from Eastside Catholic, all of a sudden, if he does wind up forcing his way onto the field right away in this hypothetical world where he does wind up at Washington, this is one of those guys who is also just going to want to put on for a city, staying close to home, all that sort of stuff that does matter at the end of the day. And seeing 4 of your top 5 linebackers being from the state of Washington, with Jonathan Epperson, Zadrius, and Ramzak all also being Washington natives. I think obviously Ramzak moved here from Hawaii, but all just people who reside here in the state. I think that's something that cannot go understated, because I remember this being a question that Jedd Fisch was asked, or I think Denzel Boston was as well, at some point during the 2024 season, with just some of the lack of representation of guys from Washington. And that wasn't through any fault of his. It was just kind of the way the roster worked out, because there just didn't wind up being a whole bunch of players from the state on the roster in the 2024 season after so many guys left for the NFL draft or for the transfer portal. You still had a couple of big pieces, obviously, with Denzel Boston and Carson Bruner being the big ones from that season. But you really want to make sure that you have a whole bunch of people that are passionate about the program because they grew up around it. Go look at the picture on Cody Green's Instagram of him and his brother wearing Husky gear, attending games here in Seattle when they were younger. Different things like that absolutely matter in the grand scheme of college football. And I feel like Lou Falamoli fits very, very well into that ballpark. One more guy I want to talk about before I get out of here is a name that I don't think I've mentioned on any of these recruiting shows just yet, and that's four-star cornerback Evan Mack from Crean Lutheran High School down in Southern California. This is a dude who just is a tailor-made fit. I know I've used that a bunch already when talking about Isala, Aisa, Wily-Ava, but at 6'3", 175 pounds, playing outside corner, this is exactly what John Richardson is looking for. And he's one of those dudes who he moves really well. I love what he brings in coverage. I think he's really aggressive. He's got really nice closing speed. I love his eyes. And I think all of those things, when you look at what John Richardson is looking for in a cornerback, Evan Mack checks all of those boxes. And we've seen the Huskies certainly go after some big names. They struck out on Mikhail Davis, who looks like he's going elsewhere, committing to Oklahoma. You see Danny Lang and Aaron Washington from Mater Dei are obviously going to be top targets. Aaron Washington being one who I believe was up on an unofficial visit at some point during the final month of the season. There are a whole lot of big name targets at the position on the West Coast. And that's without even mentioning Josiah Molden, the younger brother of Elijah Molden, former Husky star, who plays down in Oregon. Obviously, you want to secure as many of these high-end guys across just the West Coast as you possibly can. And I think Evan Mack, who, shout out to Insider Alex, is the one who mentioned this one among his Christmas wish list of top targets. I think that he's one of those guys that absolutely needs to be at the top of the board after taking a closer look at his film, because again, he's just such a good fit for what this defense is and what it's going to be. Because like I was saying a little bit earlier, Ryan Walters, certainly wants to get back to a little bit more of what he knows and what he's comfortable with in the regard of his scheme and that 5 down front, where he can just play a little bit more of an overwhelming style up front with his defensive line. And obviously it takes recruiting the Tevita Nonus, the Troy Bowenses, the Jon Ioanes of this world to make that happen. But it also requires big, long, physical corners on the outside. And Evan Mack fits that really well. Dylan Robinson obviously fits that really well. Rajon Duncan does in that same ballpark as well. I feel like Jaron Jones, certainly he's a little bit undersized in terms of he's listed at 6 foot, 160, but with his play style, he fits that ballpark as well. With what Rashawn Clark gives you in the nickel, they all fit that same skill set, so, as does Elijah Durr. And I think that if you're able to add a guy like Evan Mack to that department as well, to that room, I think that Washington's corner room, the ceiling just continues to get higher and higher and higher, because with big, long, rare athletes like Evan Mack, like Dakario Davis, like Ephesians Prysock, we've seen those guys just thrive under John Richardson. He understands what it takes to unlock those dudes' fullest potentials, whatever it is in each of their individual skill sets that needs to be refined at the college level. We have seen them improve in leaps and bounds in Richardson's time at Washington and his time at Arizona. And I think that this is one of those guys who, again, just fits really, really well into that department. That's all I got for you today. Thank you so much to all you everydayers out there for tuning in. A little programming announcement, obviously with Thursday being Christmas. We're going to be coming to you again on Friday, so please make sure that you stay tuned. And to make sure you never miss an episode of Locked On Huskies, please make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. That's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We're there. We're everywhere. We're updating the channel with new content every single day. So please make sure you click that like button, click that little bell so you don't miss when we post a new show. Plus, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, drop them right down below in the comment section. And if you're audio only, please leave us a 5-star review, as it does help us out a lot. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll talk to you on Friday.